Yes, sir. Because at the time of the murders, I was involved with the satanic cult. Since then, I've been contacted. I'm now pregnant. Anyone who knows anything about witchcraft knows firstborn child can be sacrificed and will be. I've been threatened.
Today's case is the most infamous murder case in North Carolina history. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. 26-year-old Jeffrey Macdonald was described as a charismatic, handsome, and a likable neighbor. He was actually a doctor for the Green Berets. The Green Berets are one of America's most elite special operations unit. Jeffrey was pretty much always a really likable person. In high school, he was voted most popular and most likely to succeed. He had a wife named Colette who was studying to get her bachelor's degree in English literature so she could teach part-time. And the pair had two daughters, Kimberly and Kristen. Kimberly was said to be very shy but intelligent, while Kristen was more of an energetic tomboy who had no problem beating somebody up if they were messing with her sister. And the couple really had a beautiful life. Things seemed really great. Jeffrey was a well-respected and known doctor. Colette was working hard to obtain her degree so that she could teach. And they had two lovely daughters that they loved very much. But this would all change in February of 1970 at their apartment at 544 Castle Drive when Manson-style intruders beat Jeffrey Macdonald unconscious and murdered his wife and two daughters. On the evening of the murder, Jeffrey had completed his shift at the hospital and headed for home. He picked up the girls and took them to feed their pony he had gotten them for Christmas. When they arrived home, he jumped in a quick shower and then the family sat down to have dinner together. Of course, it was a quick dinner because Colette had to go to one of her classes, but they did want to have at least a family meal together with the time that they did have. The couple had a really busy schedule. I mean, Jeffrey was a doctor, so he was always at work, and then Colette was busy with school and obviously taking care of her two girls. So Colette went to class and Jeffrey actually put Kristen to sleep first, and he had just come off a 24-hour shift, so he was in the living room and he was pretty much drifting in and out of sleep until Kimberly came down and asked to put on her favorite show. So after the show ended, he put Kimberly to bed and he went back downstairs. He'd have a couple drinks and wait for his wife to get home. And a little less than an hour later, Colette would arrive home from her class and the couple sat together and watched TV and had some drinks and just chatted. And at this time, Colette was actually about 4 months pregnant with the couple's first son, so they were very excited about this. So Colette actually was very tired. She had a really long day, so she went up to bed. But apparently Jeffrey wasn't tired at this point. Although he had just come off a 24-hour shift, he had came home, he took care of his daughters, and he was still up watching TV. So Colette heads to bed, and Jeffrey decides to finish a novel he had been reading. He said that eventually Kristen would cry, so he took her a bottle, and then he went back downstairs. He said he finished reading his book around 2 a.m., and then he would do the dishes. And when he finally went to bed, he would find that Kristen was actually in the bedroom with her mother, and he noticed that she had wet the bed. So after realizing the bed was wet, he didn't want to wake everybody up and change the sheets and then get in bed. So he took his daughter to her room, he grabbed his pillow and blanket, and he went to the couch for the evening. And then he fell asleep on the couch. And the next thing he knew, he woke up in a complete nightmare. Jeffrey would say he woke up because he heard Colette screaming. And she would say, "Jeff, why are they doing this to me?" And then he heard his daughter screaming, "Daddy, daddy, daddy." When he opened his eyes, he realized there was people hovering above him. He said that he saw 4 figures standing over him. One was a black man in a jacket with E6 Sergeant stripes on it, which is a military badge of rank or insignia. There was 2 white men, and then he said there was a woman wearing a floppy hat and had stringy blonde hair. And then he would say that she had a flickering light in her hand, which was probably a candle. She would go on to chant, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," over and over again. Although this does sound pretty insane and bizarre, in 1969, Charles Manson, who led the Manson family cult, had committed crimes like this. On the walls of one of the rooms of the victims, when the cult came in and killed them, they wrote "Death to Pigs" and "Rise," and I think they wrote some other stuff, I'm not really sure. And the cult was obviously described as a bunch of hippies and things like that. So is this theory far-fetched when the United States at this time was in a panic over the rise of satanic crimes? Not entirely. So at this point, Jeffrey is very confused. He's looking up at 4 people hovering over him. He doesn't know why they're there, and he begins to try to get off the couch to go to his wife and child. He said that one man began to hit him in the head with a club, and then he'd feel this sharp and unbearable pain on the right side of his chest, and when he looked down, he realized he had been stabbed. He said that he struggled to get up, but when he did, he pulled his pajama top over his head, and he would use this pajama top to fight off the intruder so that he wasn't getting stabbed. And of course, at this point, it sounds like a movie, but remember, he was a Green Beret, so I don't know if he had had any training or if he was around people getting trained. It does seem far-fetched, but in the context of the fact that he was in this specialized elite unit, I don't know, it seems like he might know something like that. So he's basically trying to fend off the man who's slashing at him while another man is still clubbing him. And then eventually he would pass out. Later, when he woke, he found Colette on the master bedroom floor, and the handle of a knife was supposedly sticking out of her chest. And on the headboard of the bed, someone had used a finger that they dipped in blood to write the word pig. Jeffrey would say that he actually pulled the knife from his wife's chest and then began mouth-to-mouth CPR to try to get her to respond. The one thing that bothers me about this is Jeffrey's a doctor, and we do know that if something is lodged into you, you don't pull it out because you're going to bleed to death. So if you are stabbed with something, you leave that in there until you can get the help you need. If you pull it out, there's a high probability that you're going to bleed to death. So it didn't make sense that he actually supposedly pulled this knife from his wife's chest. Of course, everyone reacts differently in a high stress situation like this, but he is trained for this. He literally is a doctor, and he's trained for high stress situations like the one that's happening in his own home. So realizing his wife was dead, he took his pajama top and covered his wife with it. And then he went to check on his daughters, and he would find them in their bedrooms in a pool of their own blood, clearly deceased. He would call 911, and he basically said, "We've been stabbed, people are dying." So police arrive, and they instantly start their investigation because 3 people have been murdered and 2 of them were children. An autopsy would later reveal the amount of damage done to this family, and it was completely sickening. Colette had been stabbed with a knife at least 16 times in the chest and neck, and 21 more times in the chest with an ice pick. And she'd been hit in the head at least 6 times with a club. And both of her arms had actually been broken, obviously during the struggle as she was trying to defend herself. Kimberly had been struck at least 6 times in the head with the club. One of those blows actually fractured her skull. And then on the left side of her face, one blow was delivered so hard that it splintered her nose and her cheek, which left a piece of bone sticking out from underneath her eye. They were also able to determine that she was stabbed in the neck several times with a knife, and it was so precisely done that they estimated it was between 8 to 10 times. Kristen had a total of 33 stab wounds, 12 in the back, 4 in the chest, and 1 in the neck by a knife. And she had 15 more done by an ice pick in her chest. And 1 finger was actually cut down to the bone, which suggested that she was probably trying to defend herself from her attacker. Apparently, when police arrived, they found Jeffrey in the master bedroom holding Colette. And he kept saying, 4 of them. She kept saying, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." So Jeffrey is a doctor for the Green Berets. So they actually lived on the Army base at Fort Bragg, which meant the Army's Criminal Investigation Division was the first to arrive on scene, and they actually thought they would be investigating a domestic dispute. So William Ivory was a 30-year-old investigator, and he was the first to arrive on the scene for the Criminal Investigation Division, or the CID. And from the very beginning, he really doubted Jeffrey's story. As he is listening to Jeffrey tell him this story, he realizes that the living room is actually relatively small. Remember, they're living in an apartment complex, and their apartment is small. And what's interesting about this is the living room was pretty much undisturbed, and the most they found was a tipped over plant and a coffee table. If 4 people had been standing over him and he was in a struggle against them, you would think a whole lot more damage would be done to that living room, especially since he said that he had to take off his shirt and he's fighting one guy, another guy's hitting him. So it would be messy, there would be blood, there would be movement, so things would get knocked over. And remember that pajama top that Jeffrey had said he was fighting off the intruder with, and then he laid it over his wife? Apparently there was dozens of that shirt fiber found underneath Colette, but apparently they had found those fibers from the shirt under Kimberly's sheets. And he had said that he went to his wife's room, he realized she was dead, he tried CPR, he pulled the knife out, then he went to his daughter's room, but he covered his wife before he left. And they found more fibers in Kristen's room, and one of those fibers had been lodged underneath a fingernail. So of course they began to wonder, did he do this? Because if he had left his top in the room with his wife, how did it get over to his daughter's room and under one of their sheets and under one nail? Doesn't seem to make sense forensically. And obviously there's an excessive amount of blood at this crime scene. I mean, people have been stabbed numerous times. And in Kristen's room, they found a bloody footprint that matched Jeffrey's. This really isn't all that surprising to me, because if he's in the crime scene and he's running from room to room, obviously he's going to probably step in blood. He's not being careful. He's trying to attend to his family. So that didn't really send a red flag to me, because it does seem plausible. But what is odd is there's no blood in the living room. And that's where Jeffrey claimed that he had been attacked and stabbed. And they found Jeffrey's glasses in the living room by the curtains, and they did have a drop of blood on one of the lenses, but that blood wasn't Jeffrey's. It turned out that it belonged to his daughter, Kristen. And Jeffrey had said that he hadn't been wearing the glasses when he went to the bedroom. So how did a speck of Kristen's blood get on those glasses had he not been wearing them when he went to check on everybody. At the crime scene, they also found tips of surgical gloves beneath the headboard where pig had been written in blood. And as police are obviously searching this house, they find surgical gloves under the sink. Again, not so strange. It is pretty much a household item. I know that I have them for various things like cleaning pet wounds or things like that. And he's a doctor, so he probably did treat his family from time to time at the house. So it wasn't strange to have them there. But what is strange is that the tips of these gloves match the gloves under the sink identically. And near the cabinet where these gloves were kept, they found drops of blood, which was the same type as Jeffrey Macdonald's. And remember, this is 1970s, so DNA testing wasn't a thing yet. They really went by types of blood at crime scenes. Outside, near the back door, they would actually find some murder weapons. There's an ice pick, a kitchen knife, and a bloody piece of wood the size of a baseball bat, which they assumed was the club that was used to deliver those blows to the family. And testing would find that these were the murder weapons. These did kill the family. And all of the weapons that were actually used belonged to the family. They were items from the household. So police are obviously looking at Jeffrey as a suspect now, and he would begin to raise more red flags by the things he said. More than once, he told investigators to let the CID know that he had taken the knife out of his wife's chest, and that's why his fingerprints would be on the knife. But tests would indicate that that knife had never actually been in Colette's chest. And at this time, Jeffrey's actually in the hospital being treated for his own wounds that he received during this intrusion, but these wounds that he sustained during this fight would bring up a whole new host of questions. According to the surgeon at the hospital who was working on Jeffrey, he said the most serious wound was a clean, small, and sharp incision in the right chest, which caused a partial lung deflation, which was apparently something that they could fix quite easily. And interestingly enough, Jeffrey was a doctor, so this is something he would know. If he had to hurt himself, he would do it in a way that wasn't going to be life-threatening. There was also 2 other small injuries, but there was no ice pick wounds, as he claimed. And it apparently came out that while he was in the hospital, his Green Beret friends came in and they shared a bottle of liquor together. I'm not sure that that is evidence of anything. I mean, a typical person who's grieving would have friends and family around, and maybe they would turn to have some drinks and things like that. I mean, your whole family was just murdered. Clearly you're depressed, you're in a state of emotional distress. So that specifically doesn't bother me about this crime, but there's a lot that does. So police kind of put together a theory based on what they think happened that night. And what's important to note that every single person in the Macdonald household had a different blood type, which is apparently pretty unusual. But due to the oddity of the blood type situation, investigators were able to piece together what they think happened that night. So basically they said that Jeffrey and Colette had a fight that began in the master bedroom. During this fight, Colette was the first one to deal a blow, and she hit her husband in the head with a hairbrush, and this would enrage him. They said that basically he picked up that piece of lumber that was in the house for some household chores and began to hit her with it. Apparently, Kimberly's brainstorm had been found in the doorway, so they theorized that during this fight, Kimberly had come in to see what was happening. They believed that maybe she was struck accidentally, and believing that Colette was dead, Jeffrey went over to his daughter and realized what happened. Maybe she was still alive, so he carried her back to her room and put her in her bed. And at this point, he realized that he really had no choice. His child was very much wounded, and it could be something that kills her. And now her mother, he believes, is dead. So he murdered Colette, and now he has a child who's severely injured. So he does the only thing that he could do at this point. He murders his own daughter. So after bludgeoning her and stabbing her to death, there was actually Kimberly's blood on his pajama top. And remember, he said he hadn't been wearing that top when he went into the girls' bedrooms. And then he would realize that he'd have to go to Kristen's room and do the same thing. They believe that at this point, Colette had regained consciousness. She wasn't actually dead, but she was bleeding profusely. So she ran down the hallway and she gets to her daughter's room and she tries to protect her daughter. Her blood is actually found on Kristen's bed cover and on the walls. And they believe that Colette threw herself over her daughter to protect her. But that didn't stop Jeffrey. He just killed them both. They said that Jeffrey would then wrap his wife in a sheet and carry her back to the bedroom and leave her on the floor, which would mean he left a footprint as he was walking out of his daughter's bedroom into his master bedroom. And this would explain where all the fibers had come from, because he was wearing that top when he supposedly murdered them. And of course, after all of this happens, he realizes, okay, I've just murdered my whole family, so now I need a story and I need to be injured as well. So they theorized he was probably already injured in the head by that hairbrush, but he needed to do something significantly more because his whole family was dead. He couldn't just be that one person that got hit in the head once and survived. That doesn't make any sense. So before he actually injured himself, he grabbed gloves, he dipped his finger in Colette's blood and wrote pig on the headboard. He would then supposedly place his pajama top on top of his wife and begin to stab her through it with an ice pick. Then he would knock over a plant, he would knock over the coffee table to make it look like there was a struggle, and then he would injure himself. And although this seems like a really great theory, the investigation really was not that great. First of all, they failed to seal off the crime scene, which obviously is one of the biggest mistakes anybody can make. There was 26 some odd people that went through that crime scene before it was sealed off, which calls into question a lot of the evidence found. An ambulance driver had actually even been in the crime scene and stolen Jeffrey's wallet. So that should tell you a lot about how this investigation was conducted. Apparently, they lost the blue fiber that was under Kristen's fingernail and a piece of skin that was taken from beneath one of Colette's fingernails. They also apparently let a doctor flip Colette over and move that pajama top. And they also let 40 sets of fingerprints be destroyed. And a bloody fingerprint was actually destroyed in the process of trying to remove it for evidence. And apparently potentially critical evidence had actually been discarded. So this investigation was a mess from the very beginning. So apparently there was also a magazine that was taken from the crime scene, and in this magazine, it did detail the Charles Manson murder, and they found about 18 to 20 similarities from that magazine to the actual crime scene and Jeffrey's house. And there was blood on that magazine, but various investigators had actually spent quite a bit of time flipping through that magazine. So again, they can't even use that as evidence. So apparently, Colette's sister-in-law knew that the marriage wasn't actually all that great. Apparently, Jeffrey had been having quite a few affairs over the years. He'd had at least 15 girlfriends since being married. And Colette she told her sister-in-law, I give up. I don't want to do this anymore. Meaning she didn't want to be married to this man who kept having affairs on her. Jeffrey had told Colette that he had to go away for 3 months and he would be traveling with the Fort Bragg boxing team. For those 3 whole months, he wouldn't be back anytime. And she was very upset because she really did have a high-risk pregnancy. She was a bit older now, this was her 3rd child, and she was very nervous. So she was, of course, clearly upset by the fact that he was just going to leave her for 3 months. And Colette would actually call her mother and said, I want to come home and I want to bring the kids. She really wanted desperately to leave Jeffrey. And her mother told her, wait until spring. We'll figure it out then. But 2 days later, unfortunately, Colette was dead, which also gives quite a bit more motive to Jeffrey. Not only was he having affairs, but apparently his wife planned to leave him and take their children. And according to a secretary on Fort Bragg, she said that she was having an affair with Jeffrey and that his sex drive didn't dull. Even after his family died, they were still having sex, and during the time he was being accused of murdering his wife and children. You would think that Jeffrey would be more focused on other priorities like proving his innocence and grieving the loss of his wife and children. Macdonald would actually go on to say, I did step out on Colette, none of which I am proud of. I don't think they were real girlfriends, they were one-night stands. I never had a love affair with anyone where we planned weekends away or divorce. I wore my wedding ring, it was the temper of the times. I like women and I wasn't thinking of the consequences. I had high testosterone. Among guys around me and people in medical school and the service, I wasn't doing anything unusual. It was 68, 70, and a lot of things were exploding. I essentially wasn't screwing around. It's not true. Colette had no fears or worries. There weren't any. So not only did he admit to having affairs, he goes on to say that he wasn't having affairs. It feels like the more he talks, the more he digs his own grave. And then something completely strange happens. I don't think anybody was expecting this. A woman actually comes forward and confesses to the crime of murdering Jeffrey's family. And not only did she, her boyfriend Greg Mitchell, who was a Vietnam veteran, also came forward. This woman who said that she committed the murders with help of others was Helena Stockley, and she reportedly confessed that she was there that night. Helena was actually well known to police. She was a narcotics informant and had a well-known history of doing drugs. And her boyfriend, Greg Mitchell, was actually a heroin addict as well. Apparently, these 2 people ran with a group of people that they called their cults, and 2 of these members actually matched the description that Jeffrey had given that night. One of which was a black man wearing a green army jacket and a white man with pockmarks on his chin and cheeks. Helena would basically go on to say that they targeted Jeffrey because he would not treat addicts. But when it came time to testify at Jeffrey's trial, she basically said that she didn't remember any of it. She basically said she didn't know where she was at the time of the murders and that she didn't know if she committed them or not. And then in 2005, a U.S. Marshal named Jimmy Britt actually came forward. He said he heard the then prosecutor threaten Helena and say that if she said she was there the night of the murder, that he would charge her with murder. Obviously, the prosecutor very much denies this claim and said that didn't happen. And apparently 3 months before Helena actually died, she traveled to see her mom with with her infant son David, and she confessed to her mother about this crime. She said that she was there and that she did it. Her brother actually went on to say that, "I know my mom in her heart believed it. My sister knew her time was short. She had cirrhosis. The prosecution used the fact that she was affected by drug abuse over the years, but my sister had no reason to make things up or lie." And apparently Greg Mitchell continued to confess to the crime up until his death in June of 1982. Eventually, this woman named Anne would come forward and say that she ran a drug rehab facility, and Greg Mitchell had actually been one of the rehab patients in that clinic. She claimed that she saw Greg Mitchell actually running away from the farmhouse that the clinic owned, and when they went inside, they found on the wall painted in red, "I killed Macdonald's wife and children." But of course, nobody was able to actually prove this. They didn't photograph it. They didn't know if Greg actually did this, so it's not something we can actually say he did for sure, or if it's just something somebody made up. Helena really didn't have a great reputation in general. Classmates would describe her as a disturbed little girl who liked to make up stories in order to get attention. She apparently told people she had to leave Fayetteville to get away from the cops, but the cops weren't actually looking for her. But she did leave 2 months later, I guess, to enter a drug rehab facilitation at a hospital. And while she was there, a psychiatrist actually saw her and took some notes. And in those notes, it said, "Beyond taking heroin 8 or 9 times a day, along with a grab bag of barbiturates, stimulants, and psychedelics, she was a schizoid personality." So schizoid personality is different from schizophrenia, although they sound similar. Schizoid personality is an uncommon condition in which people avoid social activities and consistently shy away from interaction with others. They also have a limited range of emotional expression. So basically, these people are kind of loners, they don't really talk or engage with people, and they basically lack the desire to form close relationships. So I genuinely don't believe that Helena actually committed these murders, though I'm not sure why she would confess. I know it happens a lot. People do confess to crimes they don't commit. I'm not sure why the reasoning is. A lot of the times it is mental health disorders, or they're coerced to do so. But she did have a personality disorder. She did have a history of using some pretty heavy drugs. She liked to tell stories to get attention because she really had a hard time bonding and forming close relationships. And one of the signs and symptoms of this disorder, schizoid disorder, is that they might create fantasies or stories and daydream, and they can actually make these complex inner lives that don't exist, that are just based on fantasy. So that could have happened. She could have saw the news and saw what was happening and just took on this whole idea, this whole fantasy that she was there that night. People will bring up that she did take a polygraph test and failed it, but remember, polygraphs are not even admissible in court. It's very easy to fail a polygraph test, so I don't actually deem any of that a sign of guilt. I think polygraph tests are really kind of old news, but I think they are good to use as a tool to help with an investigation. On October 13th, 1970, apparently Colonel Rock issued a report saying that charges needed to be dismissed against Jeff because there was insufficient evidence to prove his guilt. And so later that month, all charges against Jeffrey were dropped. So apparently after the charges were dropped, Jeffrey immediately applied for an honorable discharge from the Army. And once that went through, he sold all of his family's possessions at a yard sale and moved to New York. And basically he was seen socializing and looking for journalists to tell his story. Eventually, Jeffrey would move to Long Beach, California, where he was working at a hospital as a physician in the emergency room. He apparently purchased a yacht and a marina front apartment. And pretty much within days of the dismissal of the charges, he basically started doing interviews on TV. Apparently, he went on the Dick Cavett show, and that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. He basically complained about the Army investigation and how he was the only suspect and they weren't doing their job. And he also claimed he sustained 23 wounds during the attack, which obviously was not true.
My next guest is Dr. Jeffrey Macdonald.
On December 15th, 1970, Macdonald appeared on the popular late-night program, The Dick Cavett Show.
I hope this isn't too painful for you.
Where it became very clear Macdonald was fast becoming his own worst enemy.
My wife came home and we had a before bedtime drink, really, and watched the beginning of a late-night talk show. Regardless of any evidence.
I was angry.
You were very critical, in fact,
Right.
of the Army.
I'm sure I was.
Where are these investigators now who did the original?
Well, most of them have been transferred. It's the Army way of handling things. If someone really fouls up, you either give them a medal or you transfer them.
Watching the show that night, Colette's family was extremely disturbed by Macdonald's appearance. Colette's older brother, Robert Stevenson.
All he spoke about was how his rights had been violated. I don't think he once mentioned about, let's get the murderers, my family's been killed. But I remember him grinning like a Cheshire cat.
but never during that interview was he just weeping and upset and distraught over the murder of his family. And I know that not everybody cries, but you would think that at some point he would seem at least a little bit distraught about what was happening. Jeffrey's stepfather-in-law, which was Colette's stepfather, actually really believed in Jeffrey's innocence from the beginning. Both he and Colette's mother, Mildred, had testified to this, and during the time he testified, Alfred, who went by Freddie, would say, "My wife and I feel very strongly about Captain Macdonald's innocence. After all, it was our daughter and 2 grandchildren who were butchered." But then things began to change. In November of 1970, Freddie had grown suspicious of Jeffrey. Freddie had wanted a 2,000-page transcript of Article 32 of the hearing, but Jeffrey was very reluctant to give him a copy and kind of kept brushing it off. But Freddie would actually finally obtain a copy of that in February of 1971 from the Army, not Jeffrey. And he studied that 2,000-page document and took notes. He wanted to know who had murdered his stepdaughter and her children. And as he's climbing through this really large document, he's realizing that the things Jeffrey said are inconsistent and sometimes just blatant lies. And then in March of 1971, Freddie actually goes to the crime scene to compare the physical evidence against what Jeffrey had testified to. He was that determined to find out who had done this to his daughter and grandchildren. And then on January 24th, 1975, the grand jury did indict Jeffrey Macdonald on 3 counts of murder. And within an hour, he was arrested in California. He was freed on January 31st with a $100,000 bail, which was raised by friends and colleagues. He would eventually plead not guilty to all of the murders. And on August 29th, 1979, the jury that deliberated for 6.5 hours reached their verdict. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life. And then on July 29th, 1980, a court of appeals would reverse this conviction. They basically said that a 9-year delay to bring him to trial violated his constitutional rights to a speedy trial. He was released on August 22nd after posting another $100,000 bail and basically went back to work. And in March of 1982 that year, he announced that he was engaged. And then, because this case is never ending, on March 31st, 1982, the Supreme Court would rule that Jeffrey Macdonald's rights were not violated, and he was rearrested and returned to federal prison to serve out his sentence. And then on March of 2006, DNA testing would reveal that the DNA at the crime scene did not match Helena or Greg. Apparently, they did find hair at the crime scene, which had matched Jeffrey's hair. They also found a strand of hair in Colette's right palm, but it was determined to be her own. There were 3 hairs, including one under Kristen's fingernail, that didn't match the DNA of anybody in that house. And I'm actually kind of wondering if that hair belonged to the pony or something one of the girls picked up while they were at the farm. So that doesn't really worry me too much in the grand scheme of things, compared to the other evidence mounted against Jeffrey. Apparently in April 2021, Jeffrey tried to get out of prison by saying he needed a compassionate release because of his ailing health. It was denied. And throughout this, Jeffrey had actually hired somebody to write a book about this to prove his innocence. So Joe McGinnis actually took on this, and he wasn't sure in the beginning of Jeffrey's innocence or guilt, and one way or another he wanted to set out to just provide the facts. And he got full access to Jeffrey and his defense team, so he was with them every step of the way. The book was called Fatal Vision, and it actually portrayed Jeffrey as a narcissistic psychopath. And by the end of the book, you can tell the author believed that Jeffrey was guilty of murdering his family. Apparently in the book, there's also some quotes from a psychologist that stated, Jeffrey Macdonald handled his conflicts by denying that they even exist. He lacked any sense of guilt and was capable of committing asocial acts with impunity, and had been incapable of forming emotional close relationships with females of any age. And the author of the book, Joe, believes that basically Jeffrey resented his life. He didn't want to be a father, he didn't want to be a husband, and he really just wanted attention. There's also another part of the book that claims Jeffrey Macdonald had been taking an amphetamine to lose weight by a weight control program for the Green Berets. And he says that Jeffrey could have very well been in a fit of rage, a spur of the moment fit of rage brought on by this amphetamine. So he went into this fit of rage, he murdered his family, and needed to obviously cover it up. And obviously he says that this guy was a doctor. He worked really long hours. I mean, he had gotten off a 24-hour shift the night of the murder. So not only was he suffering with work, he's working these long hours, but he had other commitments. He had commitments to his wife and children and to friends, and all of this was just too much for Jeffrey. So apparently Jeffrey actually thought that Joe McGinnis was writing this book to prove his innocence, and he was infuriated when he realized what the book was actually about. He basically sued Joe, saying that it was fraud. He said that the author agreed to hear his most inner thoughts and be around everybody, including his defense team, and really be a part of the entire case to prove his innocence. Eventually, the two settled out of court for $325,000. And apparently Freddie, which was Colette's stepfather, countersued Jeffrey Macdonald after this, citing an inheritance clause, which resulted in Jeffrey only receiving $50,000 of that money. So this crime from the beginning was a total disaster. The crime scene was an absolute mess. Just everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. I firmly believe that Jeffrey Macdonald killed his family. I think the evidence points that way. Starting in the living room with just 2 things turned over. Obviously, if 4 people had been in that living room standing over him and a struggle ensued the way he said it would, that living room would probably be pretty destroyed. His wounds were superficial. He was a doctor. He knew how to hurt himself in a way that looked serious, but obviously could be remedied and wouldn't be deadly. And as for motive, I firmly believe his affairs played into it. I believe that he didn't want to be a husband and father. I believe that he firmly wanted to be free, and the moment he was free, he took off to New York, and then he went to Long Beach, and he just enjoyed his life. And I really feel that says a lot about him. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for another upload. And if you have a suggestion for another case, place it in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to it. And I want to thank the viewer who suggested this case. It was a really incredible case from beginning to end. There's just so much information. I hope I did it justice. See you next time.